Okay, so let's move on to the main part of the program, and I would like to note that in the past 3.5 decades, 35 years or so, every Republican president has been named either Reagan or Bush. So we are truly blessed here tonight to have two guest speakers that have deep ties to President Reagan and both President Bushes for that matter, and their personal experiences. They both served in the highest levels of government, so we are really proud and happy to have both of the guest speakers here. So to introduce our featured speakers, we've invited the first of the featured speakers. We've invited Shaun Kenney, Chairman of the Board of Supervisors in Fluvanna County. Before being elected to his current office, Shaun was once a candidate for the House of Delegates, serves as a communication director for the Republican Party of Virginia. He's also a contributor to the widely read online publication Bearing Drift, which you'll note is featured prominently on page 2 of the program. So Shaun, would you please come up and introduce our guest speaker?
Thank you very much. So one dignitary I want to make sure that we recognize this evening, obviously in the crowd tonight, we do have former Lieutenant Governor and former RPB Chairman John Hager. My boss. We're very glad to have him here tonight. Obviously, you know, I had a number of individuals say, Shaun, you got rid of your beard. And I said, yeah, I noticed that Chris Doomler started growing one. It could not survive the shame. So, in any event, I'm very glad to be here this evening. I stand here tonight as a young man who's just recently celebrated my 35th birthday, which is remarkable only from one perspective, is that the individual that I'm about to introduce at the ripe old age of 35 himself, an appointed Deputy Secretary of Transportation. So, Mr. Burnley served in capacity for 4 years until he succeeded Elizabeth Dole as the 9th U.S. Secretary of Transportation from 1978 to 1989. He has an accomplished record with his days with Ronald Reagan. He served as Vice Chairman of the Board of Commissioners of the Virginia Port Authority. He's a trustee and former Chairman of the Jamestown Foundation, and is also a trustee and past Chairman of the Intercollegiate and Studies Institute. He's also served as Chairman of the Roe Institute Advisory Committee of the Heritage Foundation, and is also on the Board of Directors at Freedom Works. I had the great pleasure of actually meeting Mr. Burnley and his fiancée earlier on. They are absolutely great Americans, and he has absolutely promised he will not be talking about transportation this evening. I'm sure many Virginians are relieved to hear. But he will be talking about the things that unite us and about the people that unite us, and none of those individuals was a greater uniter and a greater spirit of the Republican Party and the conservative values we all share than that of Ronald Reagan. So it's an honor and a pleasure to have an individual here who knew that intimately and understood the inner workings of that administration. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Burnley.
Good evening. I'm really delighted to be here tonight because, first and foremost, I'm not going to talk about transportation. Tables have been cleared, but we could probably have a pretty good food fight if I did. But any trip here brings back very pleasant memories of my childhood visits to my grandparents out on Rio Road in the 50s and 60s and early 70s. And additionally, I always enjoy the company of Republican activists because I've been one since I was 13 years old. And I'm particularly delighted to see how young this crowd is tonight. That's very, very encouraging. But you're all here tonight because you care about our country and you're working to get it back on the right path. And we do gather on this occasion to honor a president who did just that. He put the country on the path to economic growth and prosperity, along with peace through strength. So it really is an honor to be asked by the dinner's organizers to talk for a few minutes about President Reagan. But it's also humbling. For many people, attempting to describe and interpret President Reagan apparently comes pretty easily. After all, there are over 100 books that have been written about him and his administration, and I'm sure there are more in the works as we gather here tonight. But as I collected my thoughts and then began to write them down, it was really a challenge. In my view, he was one of the giants in American history. Furthermore, he was a great leader and a great man. It isn't possible for me to cover in a few minutes all the evidence to support my view of him, so I'm going to have to touch briefly upon his key traits that I think led to his greatness. First and foremost, he was comfortable in his own skin. He had tremendous self-confidence, but he wasn't at all arrogant. And we're all familiar with a legendary example of his self-confidence, but I want to remind you of it. In the face of strong objections from the State Department and several senior members of his White House staff, on March 8th of 1983, he delivered a speech to the National Association of Evangelicals in which he said this: "So in your discussions of the nuclear freeze proposals, I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all, and label both sides equally at fault. To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire. To simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil." Well, as many of you will remember, the next day the howling began. A left-wing columnist of the New York Times called his statement labeling the Soviets an evil empire primitive and dangerous. TASS, the Soviet propaganda outlet, said President Reagan, quote, "can think only in terms of confrontation and bellicose, lunatic anti-communism." But President Reagan not only made no apology, he continued to characterize the Soviet Union for what it was. And as he rebuilt our armed forces, strengthened our nuclear capabilities, and launched the Strategic Defense Initiative, he put so much pressure on the Soviet system that, as we all know, a few months after he left office, it collapsed. As he told the British Parliament early in his presidency, he had, quote, "a plan and a hope for the long term, the march of freedom and democracy, which will leave Marxism-Leninism on the ash heap of history, as it has left other tyrannies which stifle the freedom and muzzle the self-expression of the people." Well, I can tell you that very few people outside his administration, and not many of the foreign policy officials in his administration, shared his vision and belief. And Ronald Reagan was a visionary, although even he may have been astonished at how quickly his vision became reality. Now, both of these quotes, I think, underscore the second trait that contributed to his greatness, and that's his appreciation of the importance of his words. Of course, every president knows that rhetoric matters, but you can count on one hand the number of presidents who worked as hard as he did on getting their words right, and who understood as he did how to connect with the American people. Recall the way in which he perfectly captured and articulated our national grief after the Challenger disaster. His brief television speech concluded, "We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for the journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God." When you get home tonight, I would encourage you to take a few minutes on the internet to read President Reagan's first inaugural address. And as you do so, remember what a funk we were in as a country. Hostages in Iran, runaway inflation at home, and an economy on the brink of recession. But just in case you don't have time to pull it up when you get home, or you're too tired, let me share a few passages. He said, "In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. From time to time, we've been tempted to believe our society has become too complex to be managed by self-rule. The government by an elite group is superior to government by and of the people. Well, if no one among us is capable of governing himself, then who among us has the capacity to govern someone else?" What a wonderful way to put it. And he went on, "We hear much of special interest groups. Well, our concern must be for a special interest group that has been too long neglected. It knows no sectional boundaries or ethnic and racial divisions, and it crosses political party lines. It is made up of men and women who raise our food, patrol our streets, man our mines and factories, teach our children, keep our homes, and heal us when we're sick. For Professionals, industrialists, shopkeepers, clerks, cabbies, and truck drivers. They are, in short, we the people, this breed called Americans. And then there's a passage that particularly resonates in Virginia tonight because our outstanding candidate for governor, Ken Cuccinelli, shares President Reagan's fundamental understanding of a bedrock principle on which our Constitution is based. As the President said on January 20th, 1981, it is my intention to curb the size and influence of the federal establishment and to demand recognition of the distinction between the powers granted to the federal government and those reserved to the states and to the people. All of us need to be reminded that the federal government did not create the states. The states created the federal government. The concept of federalism, I believe, has never been more perfectly described than in that passage from 1980. Now, I want to underscore one other point. President Reagan's detractors, and there were legions of them while he was in office, often suggested that he was an amiable dunce, mouthing the words spoon-fed by talented speechwriters. To put this libel to permanent rest, a remarkable book came out in 2001 entitled Reagan in His Own Hand. It's based on the hundreds of 5-minute syndicated radio broadcasts that Ronald Reagan made between 1975 and 1979. More specifically, it revealed that 670 of his original handwritten texts were saved, and they covered every imaginable topic in that era. They're remarkable, and they were undeniably his work because they were all in his handwriting. And by the way, the book, Reagan in His Own Hand, is still available on Amazon. You should read it. Now, I count among my friends several of his White House speechwriters, all of whom will testify that President Reagan worked as hard on his speeches after he became president as he did before being sworn in, polishing draft after draft. He knew how much words mattered, particularly those of a president. And the introduction to the book, Reagan in His Own Hand, begins with a quote from Nancy Reagan. It's really remarkable. Listen to this. He wasn't a complicated man. He was a private man, but he was not a complicated one. But he was a very sentimental one. And he was a very, very good writer. All of his ideas and thoughts were formulated well before he became governor, or certainly president. Unquote. Well, of that there can be no doubt. On the day Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president, he was not a work in progress. He had fully formed his basic philosophy many years before. Again, turning to that first inaugural address, his vision of his administration was crystal clear. He said, "In the days ahead, I will propose removing the roadblocks that have slowed our economy and reduced productivity. Steps will be taken aimed at restoring the balance between the various levels of government. Progress may be slow, measured in inches and feet, not miles. We will progress. It is time to reawaken this industrial giant, to get government back within its means, and to lighten our punitive tax burden. And these will be our first priorities, and on these principles, there will be no compromise." Well, I was there, and I can assure you that he meant what he said. President Reagan was often pragmatic, willing to compromise with Congress to make progress toward his goals, recognizing that it did sometimes come, as he said, in inches and feet. But when he came to his principles, he was steadfast. Remember, in August of his first year as president, the Air Traffic Controllers Union made the terrible mistake of not taking him seriously when he said that public employees had no right to strike. You remember that? They were all fired and replaced, even though the union, the Air Traffic Controllers Union, had endorsed him the year before when he was running for president. Now, both his adversaries in Washington and internationally were put on notice that when he spelled out his bedrock principles, anyone who ignored his declarations did so in great peril. And because of his leadership, as we know, within 2 years, this industrial giant, as he called it, was reawakened, leading to more than 2 decades of economic growth. And he had one other trait that I believe was essential to his greatness. No president ever had more respect for the American people. A few minutes ago, I quoted his reference in his first inaugural address to "we the people," as he started his presidency by emphasizing that the people, not government, are supreme, he ended it on the same note. On January 11, 1989, he delivered his farewell address to the country, and he said, "Ours was the first revolution in the history of mankind that truly reversed the course of government, and with three little words, we the people. We the people tell the government what to do. It doesn't tell us. We the people are the driver, the government is the car, and we decide where it should go and by what route and how fast." Almost all the world's constitutions are documents in which governments tell the people what their privileges are. Our Constitution is a document in which we, the people, tell the government what it is allowed to do. We, the people, are free. This belief has been the underlying basis for everything I've tried to do these past 8 years. Now, that was not empty rhetoric. He sincerely meant every word of it. And I had an opportunity a few months before just to see how profound his belief was in this principle. At my invitation, he was the commencement speaker at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy in the spring of 1988. The Academy, as many of you may know, is in New London, Connecticut, which is about 25 miles from the Hartford Airport, where Air Force One landed. And so I rode with him from the airport to the Academy. And as we pulled through the airport gate, we were beginning to chat. Suddenly, the President turned away from me and looked out the window of the limousine at the crowds that were lined up along the road. And he began to wave to them, first on one side and then the other. He continued to talk with me after explaining almost apologetically that while he wanted to continue our conversation, he felt an obligation to acknowledge the people lining the road, noting that many of them had probably been waiting for a couple of hours to get a glimpse of him. And he didn't stop waving until we reached the gates of the Academy. Now please think about that for a moment. He was in the final year of his presidency. He would never run for office again. So there was no political reason for him to be so attentive to what he clearly viewed as his duty. The only explanation possible was his conviction that we, the people, are supreme and deserve to be acknowledged and respected. And we, the people, knew how he felt about us. Recall the overwhelming outpouring of respect and emotion upon his death in 2004. Now I want to touch upon, in closing, one of his greatest gifts to us. On November 5th, 1994, in one of the most poignant letters in American history, he informed us that he had Alzheimer's disease. He said that Nancy Reagan and he felt, quote, "it is important to share it with you. In opening our hearts, we hope this may promote greater awareness of this condition." He closed by writing, "I now begin this journey which will lead me into the sunset of my life. I know that for America there will always be a dawn ahead." Well, in characteristic fashion, he closed on an optimistic note. I think that was the ultimate gesture of respect for we the people. So, I want to thank you very much for asking me to join you tonight and for the opportunity to honor and reminisce about my president, our president, Ronald Reagan.